Sego Seguego. If we're so proud and honored to be here in the land of the Abenaki people, the Abenaki Nation. We're Gundi Wanahawi. We're from Akwesasne. And the songs that we share are songs that my sister and my daughters worked on, but today we're going to share 2 songs from my sister. This is Bear Fox. You'll find her on internet. And my daughter Yawandas, and my name is Gohundiso. We hope you enjoy the music, and we're honored too to have some friends join us from the Abenaki Nation. They're going to help us, accompany us.
Okay, the song that we're going to share, it's the Ohantu Kaliwatekwa, which means the words before all else. And we're going to give thanks to everything in our creation. This song came to me very strongly. I was getting ready for work one day, and then all of a sudden I could hear a lot of little children's voices together singing Guahyo Yanale, like this. They were singing it like this. Guahyo Yanale, Guahyo Yanale. And what that means is it's so beautiful. And I received a message that I'm to make a sound with this, where the little ones can learn how to give thanks in the language to all the creation. So that's going to be the chorus part. We're all going to put our minds together and agree that all of creation is beautiful. And I don't know if you can see my pictures, but this is the pictures I use to teach my students. And we're going to start with the people. And my niece here is going to translate, because my pictures are so little. So we'll begin. And you're welcome to join too. I love it when everyone sings the chorus. Guayo yanale, guayo yanale, guayo yanale, guayo yanale. Deatinu alatas neon queson a. Deatinu alatus ye ken istao hanja. Deatinu alatus ne ohne kasum a. Tunya duhak neon gwa nikola. Guayo yanale, 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 guayo yanale. Deatinu aladas ne gachum sum a. Deatinu aladas ne gahi sum a. Deatinu aladas ne ohande sum a. Tunya duhak ne ogwa nikola. Guayo yanale, 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 guayo yanale. Deatinu aladas ne ochinu wasum a.
We give thanks to the bugs.
Deatinu aladas ne onukwa sum a.
To the medicines.
Deatinu aladas ne odela sum a.
To the roots.
Tunya duhak ne ogwa nikola.
And now our minds are one.
Guayo yanale, 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 guayo yanale. Deatinu wala dusne gaya
We
tosela.
give thanks to the plants,
Deatinu wala dusne gundilio.
to the animals, to
Deatinu wala dusne ogwile sum
the
a.
trees,
Tunya dunghak ne gwa ni gun la.
and now our minds are one.
Guayo yanale, 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 guayo yanale. Deatinu wala dusne ojida ogon a.
To the birds,
Deatinu wala dusne la di welas.
our grandfather thunders,
Deatinu wala dusne gayelini
to the four
gawelage.
winds,
Tunya duhak ne ogwa nigun la. Guayo yanale, 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 guayo yanale. Sungwachi agyo kane kagala
our elder
agwa.
brother the sun,
Yeti sota asuntane kagala
our
agwa.
grandmother moon,
Deatinu wala dosne ojistano kwasong
the
a.
stars,
Tunya dunghak neogwa nikola.
and now our minds are one.
Guayo yanale, 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 guayo yanale. Deatinu wala dusne gayeleni onquetage.
The four messengers,
Danchidenu wala dusne sungwaya
our
disum.
creator,
Guachi o yanale on hoda losa.
everything he makes
Tunya
is beautiful,
duhak ne guani gula.
and now our minds are one.
Guayo yanale, 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 guayo yanale. Yawa cosa wa kweko. Yawa. We have one more song to share, and this is the one we did last night for you all. If you were at the gathering last night, it's asking. I always love to start out with this one because we're asking our ancestors and the four messengers from all the directions to watch over our families so that no harm comes to them. And I'd like to think of my family. I'm going to close my eyes and think of my family with a white light of protection around them, and I'd like to invite you all to do the same. Okay. Gayali Nyungweta ke owaduka Askwayena wase Seyatano nane akwachile owaduka Askwayena wase Yoho Ana Yoho Yahe Yoho Ana Yoho Yahe Yoha Yoho Yoha Yoho Ana yo we ya he yo ana yo we ya he kayali Niu kweta ke yo wanduga askoyena wase se atano nane akwajile awanduga askoyena wase yo ana yo we ya he yo ana yo we ya he yo ana yo we ya he yo ana yo we ya he. Yeah, go so quick. Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Hane washte. In Lakota, that is saying good day, good morning. In Banki Api Beverly, Wakia Chichia. My people call me Beverly Little Thunder. And I have the honor of being able to start, after these incredible singers, today's talk and education. When I was very young, I lived in Los Angeles. And some of you might be as old as I am to remember there was a commercial on television in which there was an Indian with a tear coming down his eye. And it was talking about saving the planet. I was back in the 70s, late 60s. That Indian was not Indigenous at all. That Indian was Armenian. And for years, this man was in the Native community, ingrained himself within our community, and was accepted by many of the settlers in that area as being Indigenous and as being an expert on who the true Indigenous people were. So this has been going on for a long, long time. And it does create a disadvantage to those of us who were born, who were raised, who may have been adopted out, who may have been taken from our families and are trying to find their way home. So it's important that we know our true histories. And so I'm honored to be able to sit here and to learn along with all of you. But before I do, I would like to start by offering a brief prayer. In Lakota tradition, when we begin to pray, we always burn cedar, sage, sweetgrass. Different tribes have different medicines that they use. And I was always taught that when we smudge our eyes, without my glasses. We smudge our eyes so that we might see clearly that which is in front of us. We smudge our mouth so that the words that come out of our mouths are true and honest and leave no question as to what we mean. We smudge our ears so that we might hear clearly, and not just hear what it is that we want to hear, but to hear the truth that's being shared with us. We smudge our heart so that all the words that come from us come through spirit and our heart to you. then we smudge our whole being, that we might always be truthful, that we might always be honest and caring and kind and loving towards one another. And so I start today with that prayer for all of us. I've also been taught that when we welcome people into our homes, and while I am Lakota from Standing Rock, North Dakota, I have been in Vermont for the last 17 years. And Vermont is now my home. It is where I will probably have my ashes scattered when I die. So I feel that it's my responsibility to welcome these speakers who have come to share with you. And we do that by offering gifts. And I have very small gifts that I would like to offer. So I hope that everybody has their ears, their eyes, their hearts open so that you might hear the words that my relatives here are going to share with you. Pelamia, thank you.
Thank you so much, Beverly. My name is Bill Falls. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students in the College of Arts and Sciences, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the University of Vermont. It's a special pleasure today for me to welcome Professor Kim Tallbear, Professor and Fellow Academic Dean Chris Anderson, Professor Brenda McDougall, and Professor Darren Ranko. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here. Generating and sharing knowledge is a central mission of a university. A way in which we achieve that mission is to welcome prominent scholars to our campus in venues like this to share their scholarship and to facilitate conversation. The scholarship we will engage with today, Indigenous sovereignty, race shifting, and a university's responsibility, as the poster advertising the event states, prompts very challenging questions. But as a university community responsible for generating and sharing knowledge, we cannot shy away from challenging and uncomfortable topics. As we look forward to this morning's presentations and the ensuing conversation, I wish to take this opportunity to remind us of the principles of academic freedom here at the University of Vermont. Academic freedom principles which are shared among universities across this nation. The following is taken from the University Manual and was adopted September 23rd, 1954. It was approved by the Board of Trustees on October 16th, 1954, and then revised and adopted by the Faculty Senate on November 20th, 2008, and the Board of Trustees on February 7th, 2009. And I quote, "The main purpose of a university has always been, must always be, to stimulate the thinking and the creative powers of its students and its faculty. As an institution, it deals in ideas, not only old and accepted ones, but new ones that may be full of explosive power. If they are explosive, they are bound to be disconcerting, even painful to some on the campus and to many beyond its borders." And I continue. "Inevitably, they will be called dangerous by the timid and the short-sighted, but to those who really believe in the fruitfulness of human thought, the real danger would appear only if the flow of such ideas should cease. For then, indeed, sterility would have taken over our campus. Our faculty would no longer deserve the name of intellectuals, and our students, regardless of degrees attained, could no longer claim to be educated. They would leave our campus accustomed only to the commonplace, satisfied with the mediocre, ignorant, or afraid of ideas which catch fire. Academic freedom is therefore not solely a right or privilege of the faculty, but is the fulfillment of the obligation on the part of the university to provide an atmosphere in which intellectual growth may take place." End quote. And with that, I wish you all a very productive and stimulating conference this morning. And again, welcome to the University of Vermont.
Good morning. We have been graced this April morning with a blessing from Beverly Little Thunder, Lakota, and with music from the Akwesasne women singers, Mohawk citizens Teresa Bear Fox, Yawentas Nanticoke, and Elizabeth Nanticoke. They were joined in their first song by Denise Watso, Abenaki, who lives in New York State, and Mali Obamsawin Abenaki, who lives in Maine. Citizens of Odanak First Nation. My name is Adrian Ivachiv. I go by Adrian as well, and I am a member of the faculty of UVM's Environmental Program and the Rubenstein School. The University of Vermont is located on traditional lands of the Abenaki people of the Wabanaki Confederacy, whose history of living here and stewarding the land and waters goes back millennia. It's an honor to have a number of their descendants present with us today. These are people, that's worthy of applause. Thank you for those who have come and who are online watching as well. These are people whose ancestors endured centuries of dispossession, war, disease, forced assimilation, and cultural genocide at the hands of French, English, and American colonists. As a land-grant institution, the University of Vermont has benefited from the seizure of land from Indigenous peoples across the United States and its distribution to settler state universities by the Morrill Act of 1862. UVM received funds from the selling of nearly 150,000 acres of lands taken from Native American tribes and is yet to fully account for that, to my knowledge. I see today's event as part of the process of learning how to do that. Almost a year ago in this room, UVM featured an event at which a delegation of the Abenaki of Odanak First Nation shared their history, described their territory, and questioned decisions made by the state of Vermont in recognizing other groups as Abenaki. That event prompted concerns, conversations, and questions across the state and region, and certainly at UVM. Questions about Indigenous identity and what it means to claim it, Indigenous sovereignty, and the responsibility of universities, and that's what should be on the signs as you walked up the stairs, not university response, but university responsibility. The responsibility of universities to first of all understand, and secondly, address these vexing issues. Today's event is intended to shed light on these questions by having a distinguished panel of Indigenous scholars approach them from a broad, in a sense, continent-wide angle of vision. Their bios are in your programs. Each panelist will speak for up to 25 minutes. Kim Tallbear, then Chris Anderson, then Brenda McDougall. Darren Ranko will offer a few minutes reflection on what he hears. We'll then have a short break while students gather questions from the audience. Please use the index cards provided and keep your questions relevant to the speakers. We have students also monitoring questions coming in from our remote attendees. That will set us up for the second half of the program, which will be Q&A. I should mention that today's event was not organized by the University of Vermont. It was organized by members of the university. Today's event does not reflect university policy on Indigenous issues, except insofar as that policy supports scholarly gatherings such as this one. We're grateful for the co-sponsorship and collaboration of the departments and programs which are listed in your program, including those at Middlebury College. We're also grateful to the staff and tech team of the Davis Center. And finally, this event would not be possible without the assistance of Suniva Tangaraj. Where's Suniva? Thank you for all your work. Administrative coordinator for UVM's environmental program. And with that, I'll pass the microphone to Kim Tallbear. If you haven't placed your phones on silent mode, please take a moment to do that now. Thank you. And Kim.
Good morning. Is that a good level? Yeah, that's my slideshow. Is it up? You'll put it up? Thank you. I'll get started. So this talk is called Self-Indigenization, Genocide, and Native Resistance. I gave a keynote last fall at the University of Southern California Symposium on Mass Violence and its Lasting Impact on Indigenous Peoples, in which I argued that self-indigenization is an act of genocidal elimination. As a reminder, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines it as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. The 5 genocidal techniques include literal killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children to another group. I find that North Americans need a refresher in the definition of genocide. Talks at the USC Symposium documented the systematic application of UN-defined genocidal techniques on Indigenous nations of the Americas. Speakers unflinchingly documented 19th century massacres, forced sterilization of Indigenous women, seizure of our children, horrific conditions of starvation and malnourishment, overcrowding, lack of access to health care, and myriad forms of abuse in prisoner of war camps, residential schools, and on reservations that also led to disease epidemics. The current epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women was also confronted at USC. My argument there and here is that self-indigenization, also sometimes called race shifting, pretendianism, or playing Indian, is a significant contributor in the 21st century to the project of Indigenous elimination and settler thriving upon the spoils of Indigenous death. Dressing up in Indian flesh and costume in order to emotionally and morally manage settler state complicity in Indigenous genocide has 300-year-old roots in settler law, politics, and self-understandings. Historian and member of a well-known Dakota family, I am Dakota, Philip J. Deloria, in his book Playing Indian, traces the origins of dressing up and performing Indianness in the United States. Deloria's historical account began in the 18th century, and it wound through the late 20th century as he recounted incidents of playing Indian from the Boston Tea Party, in scouting and fraternal orders, and romanticized literature that eventually informed anthropology. Finally, he discussed New Age appropriation of Indigenous spirituality that ramped up in the 1980s. Deloria quotes early 20th century British writer D.H. Lawrence's description of an essentially unfinished and incomplete U.S. American consciousness that produced an unparalleled national identity crisis. Lawrence saw the Indian as at the heart of American ambivalence, Savage Indians served Americans as oppositional figures against whom one might imagine a civilized national self. Coded as freedom, however, wild Indianness proved equally attractive, setting up a, quote, dialectic of simultaneous desire and repulsion, Deloria summarized. The indeterminacy of American identity stems in part from the nation's inability to deal with Indian people. Americans wanted to feel natural affinity with the continent, and it was Indians who could teach them such aboriginal closeness. Yet in order to control the landscape, they had to destroy the original inhabitants. Half-articulated Indianness continually lurks behind various efforts in American self-imagination. According to settler nationalist ideology, it is inevitable that Indigenous peoples are always dying in the face of Western civilization. Yet Indigenous existence is crucial for US American and Canadian coherence and for the production of the multicultural citizen subject. This produces a conundrum for the settler state, and it has found a clever solution. Now, before I explain that solution, I remind you that I belong to a Dakota people who faced a genocidal settler assault beginning in the mid-19th century. I am of the 5th generation to be born post-Dakota apocalypse. Perhaps not unrelated to that, I am a horror film aficionado, and I have a macabre sense of humor. So, I am informed in my analysis by the late Patrick Wolf in his serious work on Indigenous elimination published in the Journal of Genocide Research, but I combine that with an idea taken from a comedy horror film, the idea of reanimation of the dead. So this is a little complicated, I'm going to try to be clear. The settler state addresses that dialectic of simultaneous desire and repulsion that the American public has with the Indian by bringing Indigenous peoples to the point of death, while resurrecting or preserving us within the colonial state's body, its institutions, and in the bodies and lives of individual non-native citizens. Even while settler nationalism works to produce the death of Indigenous peoples and all of the aforementioned violence, indigeneity must simultaneously be made to live within settler bodies. Settler science and law disembody Indigenous peoples' blood, bones, and DNA from our individual organisms and from our collective governance. Settler society then uses those biologicals and data derived from them as cryopreserved and reanimated proxies for us. Adding to the ghoulishness of settler science and law, individual citizens sometimes drape their ontological skeletons in the vanquished metaphorical native's skin, clothing and accoutrements, and a final assumption of our so-called identities. It's very clever. Settler state citizens can retain the benefits of our elimination, but deny those benefits when they don red skin. We see the culmination of this Indigenous death to make settler life when settler state citizens with no belonging to living tribal nations take a DNA test and pronounce, "I am 5% Native American." Playing Indian along with assuming definitional control and property rights in our biologicals and our kinship relations enables settler society to appropriate yet more of our resources. The visual on this slide, 8 stages of white settler colonial denial, shows the phenomenon of self-indigenization as the final act of colonial theft and attempted Indigenous replacement. I originally saw the 8 stages posted in 2020 by a now deleted Twitter account, and I never knew who that account holder was. But the 8 stages has been shared widely and resonates with other researchers schooled across disciplines, including history, political theory, Indian law, and Native studies. I use the 8 stages to remind me and others of how interconnected are the techniques of a white supremacist settler state to eliminate actual Indigenous people. We can readily see where UN-described genocidal techniques intersect with the 8 stages of denial. Centuries of physical extermination through massacres and bounties were justified by concepts such as the Great Chain of Being and doctrine of discovery, and that placed Indigenous peoples lower in the hierarchy of planetary life. Outright physical extermination is justified by terra nullius and the right of conquest. Forced sterilization of Indigenous women and the removal of children from our families and collectives, whether through adoption, state custody, or incarceration in residential schools, is also justified by racial hierarchy thinking, facilitated by the Great Chain of Being concept. The Great Chain of Being is foundational to settler religious, scientific, and bureaucratic thought. Efforts to extinguish Indigenous languages, kinship and governance systems, gender and sexual relations are also rooted in race hierarchy thinking. And all of these historical and ongoing assaults on our individual lives and Native nations are justified and barely redressed by settler legal systems founded on those core principles. Settler societies advocate moving on or getting over it, while pursuing yet further extinguishment of Indigenous collective governance as they water down Native peoples' claims with their liberal multiculturalist doctrines. It's common for people to rank Indigenous elimination techniques in a hierarchy of importance, instead of understanding them as co-constitutive and simultaneously occurring to varying degrees over time and place. Attention police accuse thinkers focused in one area of distracting from other areas. Why are you focused on race shifting or representations of Indigenous people in sports when we have an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women? But strategies of Indigenous physical and symbolic extermination come all together in one package. They are mutually reinforcing. Our collective resistance must tackle the clever entanglements of the settler state's eliminatory and reanimating strategies. It was precisely the growing entanglement of biological resource appropriations and the centuries-old practice of playing Indian that brought me to be a reluctant expert on self-indigenization. The media has frequently called on me since 2012, when I first commented on Senator Elizabeth Warren's mythological Cherokee claims when she ran for Senate in Massachusetts. My book, Native American DNA, was finished and in press that year. The media called again and again in 2018 and 2019 when Warren announced her presidential run. Elizabeth Warren's genealogy was done by professionals. She has no documented Cherokee ancestry. The Cherokee are a well-documented nation. Warren was warned by Cherokee experts not to attempt a genetic ancestry test of a type that is not capable of connecting her to a tribe or to named individuals on tribal rolls. Her taking a test and publicizing results implied to a clueless American public that a genetic technology that only shows probable ancestral connection to unnamed founding populations in the Americas, not to particular tribes, is of greater truth value in defining what it is to be Cherokee than the facts of Cherokee citizenship, than the facts of Cherokee kinship. Cherokee people's own definitions of who they are and who belongs to them require named, documented Cherokee individuals to whom one is connected. As I wrote in High Country News in 2019, the personal genomics industry unwittingly retains older racist and colonial ideas of the unassimilated Native. Notions that shape scientists' search for the supposedly biologically distinct or unadmixed Native, which privileges the purer Native in research in order to gain a better view into an ancient, less civilized humanity. Living Indigenous peoples sampled in the course of research become proxies for ancient humans. In the settler colonial belief system, genetic ancestry is expressed as a defining trait of what it is to be Native American, or even Scandinavian for that matter. Yet Native people's own notions of belonging, in addition to contentious but vital tribal political definitions of citizenship, emphasize lived social relations, both with human relatives and with our non-human relatives in our traditional lands and waters. Genetic ancestry alone is a shallow definition of who we are. Thanks. So I have by now done dozens of interviews for print, radio, and television on various self-indigenization cases that include politicians, academics, actors, musicians, and film directors in both the US and Canada. So I have followed these stories closely for a decade. In October 2022 alone, we witnessed breaking stories about 3 high-profile self-indigenization cases in the US and Canada, people who earned lucrative and prominent positions as so-called Indigenous women. They grabbed opportunities and the mic, and they displaced and overshadowed actual Native women's voices. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, an attorney and legal scholar formerly at UBC and suggested nominee to the Supreme Court of Canada. Marie Cruz, aka Sasheen Littlefeather, a former high-profile Hollywood icon, albeit minor actress, and Elizabeth Hoover at UC Berkeley, a food sovereignty scholar. As demonstrated by investigative reports and community complaints years in the making, these 3 individuals made their claims absent credible evidence to support them. In November 2022, the Aboriginal People's Television Network broke a story about our Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith's unsupportable claim to be mixed race and descended from the Cherokee Nation. My condolences, Cherokee Nation. A 2019 LA Times investigative report documented false claimants to Cherokee identity being awarded hundreds of millions in business contracts that were designated to support minority businesses who were historically excluded from business development opportunities. In such cases, white people appropriate opportunities not only from Native nations and our citizens, but from other people of color as well in the US. Widespread Indigenous identity fraud by individuals and groups is a serious risk to Native nation sovereignty and well-being. Not only are false claimants taking professional opportunities and salaries, but in the US, self-indigenizers are attacking the Indian Child Welfare Act. They are claiming our ancestors via the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. In Canada, we had the recent Gitxsan custody case in which a quote-unquote Eastern Woodland Métis family challenged custody of a First Nations girl by her Gitxsan family. In summary, individuals and groups self-indigenize to gain control of land, hunting rights, ceremonial practices, children, human remains and cultural patrimony, educational and professional opportunities, moral authority, and as Cersei Sturm discovered in her anthropological study of tens of fabricated tribes in the US South, to transcend what self-indigenizers see as the cultural emptiness of whiteness. When prominent self-indigenizers, who are most often white people, are challenged on their claims, tribal blood quantum rules are often blamed and accusations of biological essentialism or reverse racism abound. This is an ironic accusation from people who customarily point to one long ago actual or mythological ancestor, their Indian needle in the settler haystack. Blood quantum rules are not at play in their situations. The individuals who make such claims are not excluded from any form of tribal belonging by blood rules, but rather for the fact that their claims to ancestry are either baseless or so archaic that they do not map onto actual and living Native nations. Their situations are nothing like the exclusion some of our close biological relatives suffer for not meeting certain blood rules of the tribes within which they have close social biological kin. By stealing actual Indigenous people's stories of trauma and disconnection, this is a chief strategy that self-indigenizers use to gain their authority. They conflate their exaggerated and fabricated claims with the struggles of actual Native people whose parent, for example, might be a tribal citizen, but their offspring doesn't meet blood quantum requirements. Self-indigenizers conflate their stories with those of actual Native people who were kidnapped as children, adopted out to white families or forced into residential schools, and who sometimes did not return to their Native families for decades, if ever. Self-indigenizers build their authoritative voices by grabbing the mic and speaking from false historical foundations about actual Native people's lives and what should be done about and to us. Self-indigenizers also boost their moral authority by claiming to be less colonized than in actual Indigenous peoples. Self-Indigenizers commonly claim that they and their ancestors have been Indians in hiding for generations, a sort of Indian preserve stored in a hidden cellar away from the eroding forces of the colonial state. It is true that First Peoples have been forced to reckon for generations with settler racial laws, policies, and institutions. But instead of preserving authentic Indianness, the self-indigenizer with the very long ago or mythological ancestor has lived as white for generations, with all of the attendant privileges and lack of exposure to settler laws and institutions meant to kill the Indian. Romanticized narratives of hiding in plain sight are used by self-indigenizers to discredit and further dislocate Native people from the landscape of the living. Whereas actual Native nations who have managed to survive these vicious colonial nation states must articulate our relational rules as best we can within the compromised spaces available to us. Self-indigenizers in good colonizer fashion denigrate our efforts as they seek to replace us as Indigenous upon the land. Self-indigenization is an ultimate act of colonial appropriation. Self-indigenization co-evolves with recognized genocidal strategies. It is predicated on centuries of racial science across disciplines, co-constituted with settler state laws and policies designed to kill the Indian within the human. Individuals may survive, but actual Indigenous collectives must remain conquered, controlled, and only sufficiently alive and vital to provide the biological or cultural materials necessary for the vampiric thriving of a settler state, including its individual self-indigenizer citizens. And I have to credit my co-conspirator in what I am coming to call the self-indigenization resistance, Cedar Sherbert, for the line that is the title of this next slide. Indigenous identity appropriation, and maybe we can talk in Q&A about why I cannot stand this word identity. Indigenous identity appropriation is a continuation of the Indian Wars. Cedar is a Kumai filmmaker and citizen of the Ipai Nation of Santa Isabel in San Diego County, California. In 2006, he was instrumental in outing a major literary fraud, so-called Nasdij, real name Timothy Patrick Barris. The Nasdij case broke in the LA Weekly, January 23, 2006, written by non-native reporter Matthew Fleischer. Cedar was the primary and anonymous informant for the article simply called Navajoes. It's still online. Initially believing Barris to be genuinely Navajo, Cedar Sherbert accepted an offer to write a screenplay adaptation of one of Barris's 3 supposed memoirs, in actuality a disturbing fantasist account of Nasdij's supposed life as the son of an alcoholic Navajo mother and an abusive white cowboy father. Timothy Barris wrote completely fabricated accounts that included child rape and incest. The stories Barris wrote were, as Sherbert describes them in the March 2022 Symposium on Settling Genealogies, accounts that are rife with suffering. It was almost beyond human endurance, to the point it felt like a parody of abuse. This is something pretendians do, Sherbert continued. They have these narratives of suffering and abuse. Indeed, an overfocus on despair that flattens the lives of Native people into a sea of suffering is a classic pattern in self-indigenizer accounts. On Wednesday of this week, April 26th, Sherbert gave testimony to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs related to proposed amendments to the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. He elaborated on the treatment he received from Barris when he confronted his fraud. The 2 years that I was in this man's periphery were a kind of hell. He was not forthcoming with any degree of cultural knowledge, nor was he able to explain familial ties. He would grow defensive and violently lash out when confronted with inconsistencies, threatening me with legal action and physical violence. Through the intervention of journalists at the New York Times and the LA Weekly, we were able to definitively determine that there was no Nasdij, just a deeply troubled Anglo writer from Lansing, Michigan, by the name of Tim Barris. In the Unsettling Genealogy Symposium, Sherbert described the backlash he also encountered from colleagues in the film industry, both non-native and native, when he refused to be silent after discovering Barris's fraud. Those colleagues either threatened Sherbert, "Be quiet," or coldly ignored and downplayed his anguish, the personal and professional risks he endured in taking on a major literary figure. Sherbert explained in that symposium. The overall feeling was that I had been pulled into a crime of some kind. It weighed really heavily on me. This was a harrowing time. I'm waiting to be sued. I'm given a gag order by the people I trusted who I thought were on my side. That's a director colleague. I was scared to death. I'm alone. I can't go to anybody. It was a different time. Ann Sherbert relayed to the Senate committee this week the harm that self-indigenizers do to Native peoples en masse. He said, "I know intimately the damage ethnic frauds do to others, both at the personal and collective levels. They have no commitment to the communities they claim. Their only concern being their own personal aggrandizement and career advancement. Moreover, the Native people from the communities these opportunists exploit do not see themselves in their works. They have reflected back at them a distorted and incorrect version of their cultures and are being falsely represented to the world at large, robbing real Indian people of agency and voice." Please consider this, Sherbert said to the Senate committee. For the span of 3 books, Nasdij/Barris was the preeminent Navajo writer in the world. Until he was outed, a white man was the most widely read Navajo writer in the world. Cedar and I were talking recently, and we recounted together the aggression that Native people endure as we assertively confront this self-indigenizer phenomenon. He described what he calls a cowboys versus Indians response, wherein we actual Native people are painted as the aggressors. I'll close this talk with his powerful insight. It's like a cowboys and Indians movie. We're going to take your land, and when you fight back, you are savages. You are aggressors. They call us names. They make ad hominem attacks. This is the 2023 version of an old racist Western that made us the savages when they invaded land that wasn't theirs. We are painted as unintelligent, as brutes when we fight back, especially Native women who use their technological weaponry, i.e. social media, against them. How dare they attack us for standing up for ourselves when all they do is take, take, take. This is the newest iteration of the Indian Wars. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for being here for this again and for coming back for the second part, which promises to be very exciting in part because it will be a little hectic. And I can tell you that because I have piles of questions in front of me on index cards, some of which have been jotted down from remote attendees' emails, and many of which have been collected from you in this room. And we've tried to organize them into thematic piles, which I will try to do my best to cover at least the largest piles, at least the ones that seem to kind of rise to the surface of the discussion here. And if we don't get to your question, I apologize in advance. So I'm going to start with a fairly large pile that has something to do with connecting the talks that we heard with our local context. And some of them I've gathered around the keyword of community. So for instance, questions about, we've heard a lot about individuals pretending to be Native or self-indigenizing. We haven't heard as much about communities that may do that. We've heard a little bit about bans in the Canadian context. What should universities do? What should individuals do when there are communities of people who appear to be self-indigenizing? There are some variations on this. What can someone do if they were raised being told they were Indigenous, but find out that that's a dubious claim? How to fix relationships with real Indigenous communities in that context? Again, what would you say to someone who has grown up with a generational story of indigeneity and genuinely believes this, but is not entirely sure or finds out that maybe the story might be embellished or not entirely true? What can be done when race shifters form groups, form communities? A few others in that vein. How do settlers in Vermont, for instance, work with local Indigenous communities if they're not sure which communities to look toward? And then there are some questions about specific organizations, specific projects that are facing the same set of issues. Here's a question that I think is phrased in a nice way. The fact that there are Abenaki in Vermont is impossible to deny. Shall we all throw the baby out with the bathwater? What sort of remedy should there be in a local place when we haven't quite figured out these questions of who has this multi-generational kind of historical continuity, who speaks as a community from that perspective, who doesn't, and so on. Another question, are there ways that authentication of Indigenous ancestry can be done in such a way that doesn't continue or perpetuate harm or create even more burden for those with legitimate claim to access resources they are entitled to? Again, what can Vermonters do? If blood quantum is not relevant and forced assimilation is a reality in a place like Vermont, how is Indigenous authenticity determined? And then what's the place of non-Indigenous allies around all this? What's our role? I speak as one myself. Is it to call out questionable claims to indigeneity or not, or to refrain from participating in that conversation? Is there some other role? And then more specific questions. Are there groups connected with Odanak in Vermont that are in community, that exist separately from other tribal groups and so on? What should Vermont social justice organizations do, and so on. So with that whole grab bag of questions, linking the topics to our more local concerns, I'll address them to whoever on the panel would like to answer them, knowing full well that you are speaking in a sense as outsiders. So what kind of wisdom do you have to share for us?
The couple of the first two questions are things I think about. If somebody's already asking, if somebody's saying, I've been told this story, but I don't know if it's true, that's good. Because I will tell you, I have never seen somebody who's made their career identity living off being an identity appropriator come back from that. They do not come back. Do not waste your time expecting them to admit they're wrong. In the face of all evidence, they will never admit they were wrong. It's incredible the amount of evidence they can deny. Your job is to convince other people that it's a problem what they're doing. I'm seeing this in one of the institutions where I'm talking to administrators right now. This person will never apologize. They will never admit that they have lied. Don't waste your time. But for those who are asking, that's really great. So don't just accept the stories of your elders based on all of that romanticized stuff that Phil Deloria talks about in his book. In fact, there's been some really interesting I'm not on TikTok, but people are sharing it to Twitter, like little TikTok videos of young people, especially queer people saying, I was raised with the Cherokee myth, and they dissect it, and they challenge their elders, and they challenge their relatives because they have a more sophisticated sense of the intersections of race, indigeneity, and white privilege than their white elders do. It's all white people doing this on TikTok. So I think that's really hopeful if you're asking that question. Don't be one of those people that invests your life in a lie because you won't come back from it. So that's what I have to say on those first two.
Thank you. So we have some more specific questions concerning university situations, and some of them are coming from a kind of faculty perspective. If a department is conducting a search for a faculty position in, let's say, Native American Studies, what are the best practices to achieve that, to make sure you don't fall into this trap? Other questions from students: what can students do to start truthful conversations surrounding Indigenous voices in Vermont? As a white student, if someone displays red flags of self-indigeneity, self-indigenization, what steps can or should I take? And also as a professor, another question: if a student claims Indigenous ancestry, how should I engage with that? So these are very kind of almost classroom specific, faculty search specific. Is there anything that any of you would want to add to that sort of scenario? Kim?
I was thinking too about from the student perspective. I actually think I've been doing this more because I've had my own experiences with taking people at their word, because I don't lie about who I am and where I come from. It would never occur to me to do that. I would take people at their word, and I've had to ask somebody to resign from a program I was running who made false claims to being Cherokee. I've ended up working with students who were and these are people who are coming from communities where I don't necessarily, well, the Cherokee one's not true, but where I don't have a lot of deep connections, especially if they're claiming to be Indigenous from another part of the world. And I have gotten really careful. Really careful. I no longer just let people who are random that I don't know take pictures with me, because those have appeared on their Instagram building up their pretendian claims. I will not work with students if I don't know for sure, like as a grad student. I mean, I'm happy to work with non-native grad students. I got plenty of non-native students, but if you're saying you're native, if I'm not sure, I've become very careful. You should be careful too. And that doesn't mean, I was having a conversation with a white student in class a couple weeks ago. She's like, white people really like to instruct people. I'm like, yeah, I come from a culture where you're supposed to learn by observing. And it's okay to not talk and observe and observe and observe. In fact, I was kind of told in roundabout ways that I really didn't have much to offer till I was older. It wasn't like little white middle class kids who get told, your voice counts. I was told, be quiet. Your elders know more. Whatever, there's pros and cons to both of those ways of raising children. But I learned to learn by listening and observing, and I'm remembering that lesson now. People can make their claims, and I'm not going to go after them and challenge them and inquire and dig and investigate, because I'm not an investigative reporter. But I'm not just accepting those claims at face value. I have to see over time if they're true, and you might want to do the same thing, especially not being from Native community. And I think that gets back to what Brenda was saying as faculty. And I've seen this even at the University of Alberta, non-Native faculty saying, oh, showcase your indigeneity. What? Like, you don't just tell them to pursue their development of an Indigenous identity through their dissertation. And who are you to tell somebody that anyway? You don't even know, especially when you're non-Native. You be careful. So I don't know that that's really an answer for everybody. I mean, the answer is be quiet and listen. You'll learn a lot more by keeping your mouth shut.
That's a perfect segue to my next question. But before I get to it, I just want to mention that I'm part of a faculty search right now where the best we can hope is that Indigenous candidates will apply, but we can't actually target the search on that kind of what's perceived to be a racial basis. And I'm not sure if that's a difference between the Canadian and US context or what, but it's a kind of relevant concern.
It's key, and it's one of the reasons I don't know that I can come back to the US. We are not a racial category in Canada. We have a different status. This is a problem in the United States, that we are in the census as a racial category. Mm-hmm. It really inhibits all kinds of problems. We are nations. So it's really, really a conundrum for this country. Yeah.
Yeah. So on this question of nationhood and community, and the term local community, go to your local Indigenous community, your elders and so on, keeps coming up in the Vermont context because of questions around who is that and how do we know and so on. And there are a few questions around this term community. How do we define community to prevent self-indigenization? Is there a kind of quotable definition of community from an Indigenous perspective that we might benefit from knowing? And then maybe the flip side of that comes back to the term identity, and there are a series of questions, some of them directed to you, Kim, because you mentioned that you dislike the term identity. Can you say more about this? Here's a question: how is identifying by race, and you kind of just touched on this right now, how is identifying by race not racist? What are there useful definitions of identity in this context? What's the problem with identity? And how is that related to community and to knowing kinship and so on? Can you just expand on these topics a little bit more for our benefit, given some confusion around what it might mean here?
I'll let someone else take on why race blindness is not anti-racist. That's like, who's going to take that one? But I'll talk about identity. Identity is, as I have in a subtitle of an article, identity is a poor substitute for relations. It's individual. We're talking about relations. Now we're working in English, which is a problem, and this individualistic language privileges the sense of individual identity, right? And so people are misled into thinking that they can make a choice. When you're Dakota or Pequot or Penobscot, you don't get to choose. Your people told you what you were. Right now, you've got and we want our people back who have been stolen, right? So it's a people level decision. This self-choice and identity, maybe that's for other identities. This is why it's not appropriate for us to talk about ourselves in terms of my identity is not Dakota. That's my people. That's my Oyate. That's my Tioshbae. They are Dakota people. And I tell my students too, and I've just taught all semester, to use some theory that I'm using, we're not going to objectivate, turn relations into objects. You are forbidden from using this word identity. They read in a couple of articles about it. We spend several class periods, and at the end, I'm still getting papers where they're talking about their identity. It's like people just can't get out of this mindset. So I challenge you, every time you want to use the word identity in the coming days, what are you really talking about? Often you will find you are talking about your relationships, your kinship, your families, your connections. You're not just talking about yourself. And when we solidify those relations into an individual self, and we talk about it only as me, that's getting at what Brenda was talking about, right? This isn't, if you're not committed to the collective, then you're not committed to indigeneity or to your tribe or whatever. So that's why I don't like the word identity. It's not about relations. So.
So I want to take a minute to apologize for posing that question about the border, and Jacques Watso is absolutely right. It may not be my border, as in my own identity of having placed it there, but it's not your border if you're Abenaki. Absolutely. So you didn't cross a border, even if you came from what's called Canada or New York State or wherever. So I'm starting to run out of these piles. If there are any other themes running around in the questions, please bring them up to me. I think we've touched on some of the main issues, but here's a couple of questions that sort of try to bring things out of the academic setting. You were all academics with your 50-cent words, maybe dollar words, I don't know. How do everyday First Nations citizens respond to all of this? How should we be involved? And a related question, the term race shifting has been around, or the phenomenon certainly has been for a while. Why is it now in 2023 that it's getting so much attention by academics specifically? Is there anything else to add on maybe the discord or the distance between what happens at a university like this and what happens on the streets or in the wherever on the ground
I mean, I have a couple of responses. So I get a lot of messages actually for all the abuse I get on social media, which I'm really good at ignoring because I got bullied as a child in a reservation border town, and nobody's scarier than a pack of mean white girls about to jump you on the playground, not these people on Twitter. But I do, in opposition to that, I do get emails and messages from people, often Native women in community, saying thank you. I can't take a stand. I get bullied. My kids get bullied. I can't take the social media bullying. I could lose my job. And I'm protected at the University of Alberta, as far as I can tell. My dean, Chris Anderson, has my back, and I feel that I can do this work. And so, because I'm so well placed, because my job's not at risk, and I'm old enough and self-confident enough, I put myself out front. That said, there's a lot of other people who put themselves out front and take a lot more abuse than I do. So there's that. There's also, I was talking to a couple of women at home. I'm a member of a tribal writers group, the Oceti Sakowin Tribal Writers Group. It's all Lakota, Dakota, Nakota writers in South Dakota and whatever our territories are. And they were saying, a couple of them were saying, you know, there's a race shifter in one of our communities who's married into the family, very prominent, and has actually stolen knowledge from elders and made a career off it. But they're married in. They have children who are part of the tribe. Their husband's a part of the tribe. People at home, when the voices of appropriators do not outnumber us. And when I was growing up in South Dakota, there was always one or two people hanging around who said they were Native, and everybody's like, oh, they're not. But you don't want to embarrass them. It's kind of pitiful. You tolerate them. But they're one or two among 10,000. That is not what we're dealing with in the academy. And so I had to say, I understand you're coming from community and you've got bigger fish to fry. You've got housing crisis. You've got missing and murdered Indigenous women. You've got healthcare problems. I understand this doesn't seem like a big problem, but it actually is related to all of those other problems, which is where I really began to think about that analysis of how all of these things are entangled and mutually enforcing. So I've had to tell people at home, I know you think you have other priorities, and I totally appreciate you working on what you're working on. They're on the front lines in a reservation community, but I'm working on this, and that is to all of our benefit, and I'm well placed to do that, and I don't expect you to necessarily do the same work. So that's kind of my response to what do people in community do? They're doing what they need to do. Let us do what we need to do in the positions that we are in.
So to bring things back to Vermont, and again, feel free not to delve into local issues, but they do come up in the questions here. We have some questions asking, on the one hand, do you have any recommendations for us here? For instance, a question about the governor's response. So Governor Phil Scott recently said, on the one hand, issues of recognition, who's Indigenous in Vermont, have been settled already. On the other hand, he doesn't want to get into inter-tribal conflicts. Do you have any recommendations for that? And then you have questions coming from a different perspective, saying that this event should have Indigenous people, so why were the recognized Indigenous people here not part of this discussion? Or another questioner says, addresses the definition of genocide and says, we are seeing attempts to erase the Western Abenakis in Vermont. How does this fit into your theories? So we have obviously different perspectives around this question of state recognition, what the role of the state is, what the role of the university is, and what happens when there are what appear to the public to be conflicts that most white Vermonters don't feel confident getting into. So can you say anything more to help us with these kinds of issues?
I mean, perhaps some of the recognized Abenaki here would like to answer that first question. I don't know. I mean, they're here. So we were invited by them in large part, yeah. And then I'm not a legal expert, but there is mounting opposition to state recognition. There are American Indian legal scholars saying it's unconstitutional and states should not be in the business of recognition. I'm very dubious about state recognition. We also all, and I also get really tired of this. Every time we try to have any kind of rules, governmental rules on a tribal level, and formal recognition processes, we are told we are being colonial. Every single one of you in this room has a colonial ID in your wallet. You don't move through this world without a social insurance number or a social security number. Stop being hypocrites. To live is to govern. Dead people don't govern, living people govern. And we don't get to live in some politically pure place just like you do. And as Chris, I think Chris said, who said these are settler laws? Who said that? Was that you, Brenda? These are settler forms of board, yeah. So, oh yeah, you said, and know your laws, right? This double standard that gets put on us, the only way we can live up to that standard is if we lay down and die. Do you realize that's what you're saying? You want us to lay down and die and be this Indian in the past who's sitting on a horse, all barebacked, living in this pure place. It is such hypocrisy. Such hypocrisy. So stop getting after us for having our own citizenship rules. This is the language we were given. These are the systems that we have been forced to survive under, and some of us have survived despite all of this BS stories about living in the jungle, hiding for 400 years. Some of us have actually survived as communities.
Beverly has requested a comment as well.
I'm not one of the speakers that was up here, but I'm sitting in my chair and listening to these questions that are pertinent to Vermont. I'm not Abenaki, I am Lakota, but this is my home. And all of you have the power within yourselves to address this conflict. It is the government that many of you have voted for. The legislators and the representatives are people that you voted for. And we have pretendians that are in bed with some of these people. And so it's up to you to challenge your legislature. It's up to you to send letters to Scott and say, who in the heck do you think you are? Saying, I'm not going to choose sides. I'm going to stay in the middle and keep myself lily white. So it's not up to my relatives here to tell you what you need to do. You know what you need to do. I know what I need to do living here. We all have that power. These people that are making these decisions and recognizing these people, they need to question. They need to start doing their research. They need to stop just taking things at face value. They need to stop saying, oh, yeah, you're wearing feathers, so you must be Indigenous. We need to challenge them. And I'm sorry for interrupting, but I thank you for this moment.
I'll just add, for those who don't know, Beverly recently resigned from the Vermont Commission of Native American Affairs. If you're interested in that, I'm sure she'd be happy to talk further with you afterwards about that. I had intended to connect a question to that last one, and I'll just sort of add it on, and we're about to wrap up in a moment. But that question was a bit more specific in terms of the governor's relationship, and I've got a few questions in front of me that state this, but I've sort of lost track of them on this messy podium. But it had to do with the governor refusing and the University of Vermont refusing, or at least not responding to requests to meet with the Odanak First Nation. Kim, you had mentioned there are recognized Abenakis here, and we are familiar with how the term recognized means different things. It's complex here. There's state recognition, there's federal recognition in Canada. There are no federally recognized tribes or Native American groups in Vermont, and so on. But I just did want to mention it, and again, offer you the opportunity if you want to say anything about what the responsibility of a university might be, or of a state, in responding to what seem to be tribes across a border. And we've kind of looked at this already. Is there anything to add? Even if they live here and they move through here, but the tribal office happens to be across a national border. Big pause. If there's nothing to add, we can move on. Maybe I'll offer the opportunity for any final last comments as well before we wrap up.
So I was going to say, and this does not mean Canada's more moral, it's not. There's just a greater percentage of Native people there, and that matters in terms of visibility. Numbers really matter. And so in general, we're farther along in the Canadian Academy having these conversations. It is at a very rudimentary level across the US. I talk to a lot of people. It makes it very difficult to think about being in the US Academy. People are simply unwilling to have the conversation. Really unwilling. That is such a problem. I think being willing to sit down and have the conversation is really important. And if you're willing to do that, you're already ahead of most US universities, which is surprising given that there's such a low density of Native people around here. I mean, relatively speaking, I come from South Dakota, so take that with what I say, right? We are the visible minority out there. So I think that's actually, I think that's actually quite brave for people to have taken this on, and I think that's really a beginning start. I see even at the University of Alberta, where we're having really deep and extensive regular meetings about Indigenous documentation, rules, how we have lawyers in on these conversations. We've got to think about the union, all the things that Chris was talking about, really in-depth conversations that I think, I'm not sure any US university has begun doing that. And it's difficult and it's going to take many years, but we do have these really nuanced, deep conversations, 2 to 3 hour meetings where we're talking about particular cases, particular hires, particular job ads. To sit there and say that you can't have the conversation and you can't ask about people's relations, that's also not how Indigenous people do things. I can go anywhere in this country, meet another Native person, and within 2 name drops, we find somebody we know in common, both because we were networked as Native people pre-colonization and we have been forcibly networked in other ways post-colonization. So we know people who know people, and we can do this work. So anyway, thank you for having the conversation. It's, I don't think it's very common in the US Academy to be having a conversation of this depth. So thank you.
So before we wrap this up, I was approached a little before the beginning of this event by Chief Rick Obomsawin of the Odanak First Nation, and asked by him if I would allow him to come up and offer gifts to the guests. And I thought that was a very kind gesture and a wonderful way to maybe wrap up the event. So I would like to invite him to do that now.
I'm short. Kwai. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Chief Rick Obomsawin. I'm an elected chief of the Odanak Band in Canada, of the Abenaki Nation. And I say nation, not tribes. And one day I'll get that through the governor's head that we're not tribes, we're nations. My father was John Paul Obomsawin. My grandfather was George Obomsawin. My great-grandfather was Simeon Obomsawin. I can go back 300 years, so I don't want to bore you, okay? I'm only adding that in to link back what we always talked about. Family is important. I want to thank this panelist. What a tough job. I know I was sitting in my chair there thinking, oh my God. I want to thank you very, very much from our nation to use. I brought some gifts for yous. My colleague Danielle will hand them out to you. These are baskets made in my community out of ash. Like the basket, They are weaved together with many stories, many things put into it as they're done. These baskets were made by some of the elders in my community. This is what we're doing today. The same thing that this basket has done. It is weaving things together. I've listened to a lot of the questions, and I know I'm not really allowed to talk here, but I'm trying not to. I've listened to a lot of the questions, and the biggest key to all the answers is communication. We need to talk to one another. We need to sit down and discuss. Arguing and fighting is not going to solve a thing. We need to at least sit and try to pull things together. Some of us will find that stories in the past weren't the stories we thought they were. And some will find the stories that we thought they weren't are. But the truth has to come out. And that's what these things are all about. And I want to thank the university for doing this. I want to thank everyone for being here on Abenaki unsurrendered territory. This land belongs to the Abenaki people, and the governor will learn that. I promise. I thank you very much.
So on that note, I'd like to thank from the bottom of all our hearts, I think, the guests, the speakers, some of whom traveled quite far to get here, the musicians, all of you who have traveled to come here, those of you who are watching online, and the University of Vermont for having this event here today, and the people who were instrumental in organizing it as well. Thank you all, and have a wonderful Friday.